You understand, David, that since Richard's passing, your connection to this family is, well, rather tenuous now, isn't it? You're not truly family anymore, not in the same way. We need to be practical about these things. The words, delivered with a cool, appraising tone my mother-in-law, Eleanor, usually reserved for discussing underperforming stocks or unsatisfactory catering services, hung in the air of her overly ornate living room, a stark counterpoint to the delicate china teacups and the scent of Earl Grey. My name is David Miller, 56 years old, and until 6 months ago, I had been the devoted husband of Richard Ainsworth, Eleanor's only son, for 22 years. Richard, a man whose kindness and gentle humor had been the bedrock of my life, had been taken from us far too soon by a sudden, aggressive illness. Now, it seemed, his grieving widower was being subtly, but unmistakably, deaccessioned from the Ainsworth family archives. Eleanor, a woman whose formidable social standing was matched only by her steely resolve and her rather flexible interpretation of familial loyalty, sipped her tea, her gaze unwavering. Her husband, Arthur Ainsworth Sr., a man whose pronouncements on any subject usually carried the weight of papal decrees within the family, merely grunted in agreement, his attention seemingly fixed on a particularly unappetizing cucumber sandwich. Richard's younger sister, Caroline, a woman whose ambition often outstripped her empathy, offered a small, almost imperceptible smirk. This wasn't just a casual observation on Eleanor's part. This was the opening salvo in a campaign I had suspected was coming, a campaign to gently, but firmly, exclude me from the future disposition of the Ainsworth family estate, an estate that was, by all accounts, substantial. I placed my teacup carefully back on its saucer, the delicate china clinking softly in the sudden, charged silence. Eleanor, Arthur, I began, my voice calm, betraying none of the cold fury that was beginning to solidify within me. Richard and I built a life together over 2 decades. We shared a home, a history, a deep and abiding love. Our connection was, and remains, as real and as binding as any forged by blood. To suggest otherwise is deeply disrespectful to his memory, and frankly to me. Eleanor waved a dismissive hand, adorned with several large, antique rings that had once belonged to Richard's grandmother. Oh, David, don't be so dramatic. Of course, we all loved Richard, and we were fond of you. But blood is blood, and now that Richard is gone, the Ainsworth legacy, the estate, it naturally reverts to the direct bloodline, to Caroline and her children. It's simply the way of things. The way of things. A convenient euphemism for the way we want things to be, now that the primary inconvenient emotional attachment is no longer present. What Eleanor, Arthur, and Caroline didn't know, what they had clearly underestimated in their rather crass assessment of my tenuous connection, was that Richard, a man of quiet foresight and deep integrity, had also understood the way of things within his own family, and he had taken meticulous, legally sound steps to ensure that his wishes and my future security would not be subject to their practical reinterpretations. For the past 2 decades, I had been not just Richard's husband, but also his partner in a small, highly successful rare book and manuscript dealership we had built together from scratch. My expertise lay in authentication, provenance research, and the often arcane world of bibliographic forensics. Richard had been the charming frontman, the passionate collector, the one with the uncanny ability to unearth forgotten treasures. But I had been the quiet engine room, the one who verified the authenticity, traced the ownership, and ensured that every acquisition was sound, every transaction legally watertight. Our business, Ainsworth and Miller Antiquarian Books, was a significant asset in itself, an asset Eleanor and Arthur seemed to conveniently overlook in their focus on ancestral lands and inherited silver. More importantly, Richard, aware of his family's traditional views on inheritance and their occasional dismissiveness towards me, had, years ago, with the help of our astute solicitor, Alastair Finch, a man whose discretion was as legendary as his grasp of complex estate law, put in place certain safeguards. These safeguards were currently residing in a secure deposit box, a collection of meticulously prepared documents that, I suspected, would paint a rather different picture of Richard's intentions than the one Eleanor was so confidently presenting. The cucumber sandwiches suddenly seemed even less appealing. "Eleanor," I said, my voice still calm, but with an undercurrent of something new, something harder, "I appreciate your candor regarding your interpretation of family. However, I believe Richard's interpretation, as legally documented, might offer a somewhat different perspective. Perhaps it's a conversation best had with our respective legal counsel present." Her eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. The mention of legal counsel was clearly not part of her anticipated script. Arthur Sr. actually paused mid-chew, his gaze sharpening. Caroline's smirk faltered. "Legal counsel?" Eleanor repeated, her voice a little cooler now. "Is that a threat, David?" "Not a threat, Eleanor," I replied. "Merely a suggestion, a practical one, to ensure that all matters are handled with the clarity and precision that Richard himself would have insisted upon." After all, I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch my lips. We wouldn't want any misinterpretations of the historical record, would we? As a family that values its legacy so highly. The game, it seemed, was afoot. They had made their opening move, a rather clumsy attempt to emotionally and legally sideline me. They had no idea that Richard and I, anticipating just such a contingency, had prepared a countermove years ago, a meticulously documented strategy that was about to be deployed with the quiet, devastating efficiency of a perfectly preserved first edition. The Ainsworth family dinner was about to become a rather more engaging affair than they had planned, and the tenuous connection they so casually dismissed was about to reveal itself as a legally binding and financially significant Gordian knot they would not easily unravel. The weeks following that initial, chillingly polite tea party at the Ainsworth ancestral home were a masterclass in passive-aggressive maneuvering on their part and quiet, methodical preparation on mine. Eleanor, Arthur Sr., and Caroline, whom I privately referred to as the triumvirate of entitlement, began a subtle but unmistakable campaign to marginalize me, to gently but firmly nudge me towards the periphery of Richard's legacy, and more importantly, his estate. Invitations to long-standing family gatherings became misplaced. Calls to inquire about the progress of settling Richard's personal effects were met with vague, evasive answers. Caroline even had the audacity to suggest, through a third party, that it might be less painful for me if she handled the disposition of Richard's extensive collection of antique maps, a collection we had built together over 2 decades, each piece a shared passion, a shared discovery. The implication was clear. I was an outsider, a temporary fixture in Richard's life, whose claims, both emotional and material, were now considered secondary to those of the direct bloodline. They underestimated me. They always had. They saw me as Richard's quiet, bookish spouse, the slightly eccentric academic type who was more comfortable in dusty archives than in the cut-and-thrust world of finance and influence that they inhabited. They had no real understanding of my profession, of the meticulous forensic skills required to authenticate a rare manuscript, to trace its provenance through centuries of complex ownership, to identify a clever forgery hidden beneath layers of plausible deception. These were skills, as it turned out, that were remarkably transferable to the equally complex and often equally deceptive world of estate settlement when avaricious relatives were involved. My first call after that initial tea party had been to Alastair Finch, our solicitor. Alastair, a man whose calm demeanor masked a mind as sharp as a medieval scholar's stylus, had listened to my account of Eleanor's pronouncements with a thoughtful silence. "Ah, yes, David," he'd said finally, his voice dry as parchment. "The tenuous connection argument. A classic, if rather distasteful, opening gambit in these unfortunate situations. It seems the Ainsworths are preparing to contest the spirit, if not yet the letter, of Richard's clearly expressed wishes. We must, therefore, ensure that the letter is so robust, so unassailable, that the spirit is rendered legally undeniable. Richard and I, under Alastair's guidance, had indeed been meticulous. Years ago, Anticipating precisely this kind of familial avarice, Richard, for all his kindness, was under no illusions about certain members of his family. We had restructured our assets. Our business, Ainsworth and Miller and Aquarium Books, was a formal partnership with clear survivorship clauses. Our home, the charming Victorian townhouse we had lovingly restored, was jointly owned with right of survivorship. And Richard's personal investments, including the significant portfolio he had inherited from his own grandfather, had been placed into a carefully constructed testamentary trust, with me named as the primary beneficiary and, crucially, as the sole executor and trustee. This trust, Alastair had explained at the time, was designed to be as impervious to familial challenge as Fort Knox. It was a legal fortress built with layers of contractual safeguards, clear statements of intent, and witnessed by unimpeachable third parties. Eleanor's dismissive wave of the hand, her casual assertion that the Ainsworth legacy naturally reverts to the direct bloodline, was about to collide with the unyielding bedrock of meticulously drafted legal reality. While Alastair began the formal process of notifying the Ainsworth's legal counsel, a rather pompous, old-school firm named Weatherby and Cogsbill, who clearly considered Alastair's more modern, incisive approach rather déclassé, of my position as executor and primary beneficiary, I began my own, quieter investigation. I needed to understand the full scope of their intentions, the precise nature of the pressure they were likely to exert. My primary concern was Richard's collection of antique maps. It was not just immensely valuable financially. It was our shared passion, a tangible representation of our life together, of the intellectual journeys we had undertaken, the discoveries we had made. Caroline's attempt to usurp control of it was more than just a financial grab. It was an attempt to erase my part in Richard's life, to rewrite our shared history. I remembered Richard mentioning, some months before his illness took its final, swift hold, that he had been working on a comprehensive catalog of the map collection, a project he was undertaking with a young, enthusiastic archivist from the local university, a Ms. Penelope Davies. He'd spoken highly of her diligence and her keen eye for detail. I decided to contact Ms. Davies. Perhaps she could shed some light on the collection's current status and on any recent Ainsworth family interest in its disposition. Penelope Davies was, as Richard had described, bright, articulate, and possessed of an almost reverential respect for the historical artifacts she worked with. She was also, I quickly discovered, deeply loyal to Richard's memory, and more than a little wary of Caroline Ainsworth's rather forceful personality. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice hesitant when I first introduced myself over the phone, "I'm so glad you called. Mr. Ainsworth. Richard, he spoke of you often, with great affection and immense respect for your expertise." This was a welcome balm to my bruised spirit. "Ms. Davies," I began, "I understand you were assisting Richard with cataloging his map collection. I'm now, as his executor, tried to ensure his wishes for its preservation are honored. Has anyone else from the Ainsworth family been in contact with you regarding the collection recently?" There was a distinct pause on the other end of the line. "Yes, Mr. Miller," she said finally, her voice dropping almost to a whisper. "His sister, Miss Caroline Ainsworth Smythe." Caroline had, with typical pretension, hyphenated her name after marrying a man whose primary asset was a vaguely aristocratic lineage, contacted me last week. She informed me that she would now be overseeing the collection, and that she required immediate access to all of Richard's cataloging notes and any preliminary valuations he might have discussed with me. "And did you provide her with this information?" I asked, my own voice carefully neutral. "No, sir, I did not," Penelope replied firmly. "Richard had given me very specific instructions regarding the confidentiality of his research. And frankly, Mr. Miller, Ms. Ainsworth Smythe's demeanor was rather alarming. She seemed less interested in the historical significance of the maps and more concerned with their immediate market value. She even asked if I knew any reputable auction houses that specialized in quick, discreet sales. My blood ran cold. Caroline wasn't just trying to take control of the collection. She was planning to liquidate it, to sell off pieces of our shared history, our shared passion, for a quick profit. This was more than just disrespect. It was a desecration. "Ms. Davies," I said, "you have done Richard and me a great service. Please do not release any information to Ms. Ainsworth Smythe or any other member of the Ainsworth family without my express, written consent. I am the sole legal executor of Richard's estate. I will be in touch with you shortly with formal documentation to that effect." "Understood, Mr. Miller," she replied, a note of relief in her voice. "And for what it's worth, Richard always said that if anything ever happened to him, he knew you would be the one to protect the integrity of his collections. He trusted you implicitly." Her words, a simple statement of Richard's faith in me, were like a shield, a reinforcement against the petty avarice of his surviving relatives. The battle lines were being drawn more clearly now. This wasn't just about money or property. It was about memory, about legacy, about love. And I, David Miller, the quiet, bookish spouse, the man with the tenuous connection, was about to demonstrate just how strong and how legally binding those connections truly were. The Ainsworths were about to discover that an expert in provenance can trace more than just the ownership of a rare book. He can also, with equal precision, trace the undeniable, irrefutable provenance of a life well-loved and a legacy well-protected. The formal notification from Alastair Finch, outlining my legal standing as sole executor and primary beneficiary of Richard's trust, landed on the Ainsworths' respective doormats with the gentle thud of a well-bound legal volume. Heavy, authoritative, and utterly unignorable. Their solicitor, Mr. Weatherby of Weatherby and Cogsbill, a man whose legal strategies seemed to have been last updated in the era of quill pens and parchment, responded with a sputtering letter filled with indignant pronouncements about the sanctity of the direct bloodline and vague, unsubstantiated insinuations about undue influence on my part during Richard's vulnerable final years. Alastair's reply was a masterpiece of polite, razor-sharp legal evisceration, citing specific clauses from Richard's meticulously drafted trust document, referencing established case law on testamentary freedom, and gently reminding Mr. Weatherby of the rather severe penalties for making vexatious and unsupported claims in probate court. Mr. Weatherby, Alastair later reported to me with a dry chuckle, fell remarkably silent after that. The triumvirate of entitlement, however, was not so easily subdued. Deprived of a direct legal avenue to challenge Richard's primary wishes, they shifted their strategy to one of attrition, a campaign of petty harassments and emotional blackmail clearly designed to wear me down, to make me question my resolve, perhaps even to induce me to offer some sort of conciliatory financial gesture to make them go away. Caroline was the most overt. She began a series of increasingly agitated phone calls. Not to me directly. Alastair had instructed me to refer all communications to him, but to mutual acquaintances, to distant relatives, even, to my astonishment, to some of the dealers and collectors Richard and I had worked with over the years. Her narrative was consistent. She was the grieving sister, cruelly denied access to her beloved brother's cherished possessions by his grasping, opportunistic spouse, who was clearly only interested in their monetary value. She painted herself as the custodian of the true Ainsworth legacy, the one who understood the sentimental importance of heirlooms, while I was portrayed as a cold, calculating outsider, ready to auction off Richard's life's work to the highest bidder. The irony, given her earlier conversation with Penelope Davies about quick, discreet sales, was apparently lost on her. Eleanor, Richard's mother, adopted a more insidious approach. Her calls to me, which Alastair had reluctantly permitted on the grounds of maintaining a semblance of familial civility, however strained, were filled with tearful reminiscences of Richard's childhood, subtle digs at my lack of true understanding of the Ainsworth family traditions, and plaintive inquiries about certain small mementos she felt she, as his mother, was surely entitled to. A silver christening mug here, a set of ancestral cufflinks there, his grandfather's antique pocket watch. Each request, innocuous on its own, was part of a larger strategy, a death-by-a-thousand-cuts approach to chipping away at the integrity of Richard's estate, and by extension, my resolve. Arthur Sr., for his part, remained largely silent, a brooding, disapproving presence in the background, occasionally interjecting with a gruff comment about the unseemliness of it all, clearly implying that I was the one being unseemly by simply adhering to Richard's legally expressed wishes. Through it all, I remained calm, polite, and unyielding. All requests, all inquiries, all emotional appeals were met with the same response. Please direct your communication to my solicitor, Mr. Alastair Finch. He is handling all matters related to Richard's estate. This infuriated them, of course. It denied them the emotional engagement, the opportunity for manipulation that they craved. It reduced our interactions to the cold, hard calculus of legal fact, a terrain where they were hopelessly outmatched. The battle for the map collection became a particular point of contention. Caroline, through Mr. Weatherby, formally requested that the collection be donated in its entirety to the Ainsworth Family Historical Society, a society that, to my knowledge, consisted primarily of herself, her mother, and two bewildered distant cousins, with herself appointed as its sole curator. This, she argued, would ensure its preservation for future generations of Ainsworths. Alastair's response was a polite but firm refusal, citing Richard's explicit instructions in his trust document that the map collection, along with our shared antiquarian book business, was to remain under my sole stewardship, with a view to its eventual and carefully considered placement in a suitable academic institution or museum that could ensure its proper conservation and scholarly access. This, of course, did not sit well with Caroline. Her next move was to attempt to physically remove several key maps from Richard's study in our jointly owned townhouse, where I was still residing, much to their chagrin, as per the terms of our joint tenancy agreement. She arrived one afternoon, unannounced, with two burly men from a local moving company, demanding access to the study to retrieve some family heirlooms. Fortunately, I had anticipated such a maneuver. The study was securely locked, and our longtime housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, a woman of immense loyalty and formidable presence, had been quietly alerted to the possibility of unauthorized deaccessioning attempts. Mrs. Gable, bless her stalwart heart, politely but firmly denied Caroline access, citing my explicit instructions, and even, with a touch of theatrical flair I hadn't known she possessed, threatened to call the police if Caroline and her removal associates did not vacate the premises immediately. Caroline, faced with Mrs. Gable's unshakable resolve, and perhaps the unsettling prospect of a public altercation involving law enforcement, had retreated, sputtering with impotent fury. The incident, however, served as a valuable data point. It demonstrated the lengths to which Caroline was prepared to go and the increasing desperation of their tactics. Alastair used it to file a formal complaint with the probate court regarding Caroline's attempts to interfere with the lawful administration of the estate, a move that further weakened Mr. Weatherby's already crumbling position. But the triumvirate of entitlement had one more card they believed they could play, a card they clearly thought was their ace in the hole. The annual Ainsworth Family Foundation Charity Gala, a lavish, high-profile event that Eleanor had presided over for decades, a cornerstone of her social standing in the city. The invitation, when it arrived, was addressed to Mr. David Miller and guest, a subtle but deliberate underscoring of my now officially singular status. Attached was a handwritten note from Eleanor. "David, dear, we do so hope you will feel able to attend. It would mean so much to the foundation and to Richard's memory, and perhaps it would be an opportunity for us all to begin the healing process in a public forum where goodwill and generosity prevail." The trap was obvious. They intended to use the gala, a public stage filled with their influential friends and associates, to pressure me, to shame me, perhaps even to publicly appeal for a more equitable and compassionate resolution to the estate matter. They were counting on my desire to avoid a public scene, on my supposed discomfort in their rarefied social sphere. They had, once again, fundamentally misjudged their opponent. I RSVP'd immediately. Mr. David Miller will be delighted to attend, and he will indeed be bringing a guest. My guest, I had already decided, would be Alastair Finch. And Alistair, I knew, was not averse to a bit of public legal discourse, especially when the cause was just and the opposition so transparently avaricious. The Ainsworth Family Foundation Charity Gala was about to become the venue for a rather different kind of philanthropic endeavor, the public and legally sound defense of Richard Ainsworth's true legacy. And I, the quiet book dealer, the man with the tenuous connection, was about to deliver a masterclass in bibliographic forensics applied to the rather messy first folio of my late husband's family. The Ainsworth Family Foundation Charity Gala was held, as always, in the grand ballroom of the city's most ostentatious hotel, a cavernous space dripping with crystal chandeliers and an almost palpable aura of self-congratulatory affluence. Eleanor, as the grande dame of the foundation, was in her element, gliding through the assembled throngs of the city's elite, her diamonds glittering, her smile a carefully calibrated blend of regal beneficence and subtle social maneuvering. Arthur Sr. stood beside her, a stiff, portly penguin in his tuxedo, occasionally offering a gruff pleasantry to a passing magnate. Caroline, resplendent in a gown that seemed designed more for a Hollywood red carpet than a local charity event, was flitting from group to group, her laughter a little too loud, her charm a little too forced. They were a formidable trio, the undisputed monarchs of this glittering, if somewhat shallow, kingdom. Alistair Finch and I arrived deliberately late, just as the interminable cocktail hour was winding down and the guests were beginning to drift towards their assigned tables for dinner. Our entrance, though quiet, did not go unnoticed. A ripple of hushed whispers followed us as we were escorted to our table, a rather conspicuously placed one, I noted with a grim internal amusement, directly in front of the main dais. Clearly, Eleanor intended for me to be a highly visible and presumably highly uncomfortable participant in whatever performance she had planned. Alistair, a man utterly unfazed by social pressure or ostentatious displays of wealth, simply surveyed the room with the cool, appraising gaze of a seasoned litigator sizing up a potentially hostile jury. He looked, I thought, rather like a very intelligent, very patient hawk, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. Dinner was a tedious affair, a succession of bland, overpriced courses punctuated by even blander, more overpriced speeches from various local dignitaries and foundation board members, each one extolling the virtues of philanthropy and the tireless efforts of the Ainsworth family in uplifting the community. Through it all, I could feel Eleanor's gaze on me, a constant, probing pressure. She was waiting, I knew, for the right moment to deploy her strategy, to use this public forum to her advantage. It came, as I had anticipated, just before dessert. Eleanor, with a flourish, took to the podium, her voice resonating with a carefully rehearsed emotion. She spoke eloquently of Richard, of his generous spirit, his deep commitment to family, his desire to see the Ainsworth legacy continue, strong and united. She then, with a subtle shift in tone, began to speak of the challenges that can arise in settling a loved one's affairs, of the painful misunderstandings that can sometimes cloud even the clearest of intentions. Her gaze, as she spoke these words, rested directly on me. It was a masterful performance of veiled accusation, designed to paint me as an impediment to Richard's true wishes, an outsider disrupting the natural, harmonious flow of familial inheritance. The room was silent, attentive. This was the moment she had been building towards. And so, she continued, her voice now trembling with artfully feigned emotion, it is with a heavy heart, but also with a profound sense of familial duty, that I wish to make a public appeal tonight. An appeal to David, Richard's cherished partner. An appeal for understanding, for compassion, for a willingness to set aside any unfortunate legal formalities and to embrace a solution that truly honors Richard's memory, a solution that ensures the Ainsworth family legacy, his legacy, remains intact for generations to come, within the direct bloodline that he himself held so dear. She paused, allowing her words, her carefully crafted image of the grieving mother seeking only unity and the preservation of tradition, to sink in. Several guests, particularly those of her own generation, nodded in sympathy, their eyes moist with vicarious sentimentality. Caroline, at her table, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, a perfect echo of her mother's performance. This was their ace in the hole, a public shaming, an emotional pincer movement designed to isolate me, to pressure me into capitulating to their demands regarding Richard's estate, particularly the map collection and certain other valuable assets they still coveted. They expected me to crumble, to be overwhelmed by the weight of public opinion and familial expectation. They had, once again, profoundly misread their man. As Eleanor stepped down from the podium to a round of polite, if somewhat bewildered, applause, I rose slowly from my seat. Alastair Finch, beside me, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. I walked to the podium, my movements calm, deliberate. The room fell into an expectant hush. Eleanor, Arthur, Caroline. I began, my voice clear and steady, carrying easily through the vast ballroom without the need for a microphone. And to all of you, friends and supporters of the Ainsworth Family Foundation, I, too, share Eleanor's profound desire to honor Richard's memory and to ensure his true legacy is preserved. I paused, my gaze sweeping over the room, meeting Eleanor's surprised and suddenly apprehensive eyes. And it is precisely for that reason, I continued, that Richard himself, with characteristic foresight and a deep understanding of certain familial dynamics, took meticulous legal steps years before his passing to ensure his wishes would be unequivocally clear and legally unassailable. I then reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew not a handkerchief, but a slim, leather-bound document. It was a certified copy of Richard's last will and testament, the one establishing the trust, naming me as executor and primary beneficiary, and explicitly detailing his intentions for the disposition of all his assets, including the map collection and our shared business. Richard, I stated, my voice resonating with a quiet, unshakable authority, believed as I do, that a legacy is not just about bloodlines, but about shared passions, shared endeavors, shared love, and mutual respect. His will, a document drafted with the expert counsel of Mr. Alastair Finch, who I am honored to have as my guest this evening, reflects those beliefs with absolute clarity. I then, calmly and methodically, read aloud several key passages from the will, the clauses establishing the trust, the explicit instructions regarding my stewardship of his collections, his clearly stated desire that our shared life's work be preserved and eventually placed in institutions that would ensure its scholarly access and long-term conservation, not dispersed or liquidated for short-term gain. With each word I read, I could see the color draining from Eleanor's face, the dawning horror in Caroline's eyes, the stunned disbelief on the faces of their assembled friends and allies. The narrative they had so carefully constructed, the image of the grieving family beset by a grasping outsider, was visibly and irrevocably disintegrating. Richard's legacy, I concluded, my voice firm, is not a piece of property to be squabbled over or a financial windfall to be opportunistically seized. It is a testament to a life lived with passion, with integrity, and with a deep love for knowledge and beauty. And I, as his husband, his partner, and the executor of his legally expressed wishes, will honor that legacy with the same meticulous care and unwavering commitment he himself demonstrated throughout his remarkable life. Any attempt to subvert those wishes, to misappropriate those assets, or to rewrite that history has been, and will continue to be, met with the full and unyielding force of the law. I then placed the copy of the will on the podium, a tangible symbol of Richard's true intent. The silence in the ballroom was now absolute, broken only by a few scattered, incredulous gasps. The Ainsworth Family Foundation Charity Gala had indeed become the venue for a rather dramatic revelation, but it was not the one Eleanor had planned. The tenuous connection had just demonstrated its irrefutable, legally binding, and very public strength. The historical record, it seemed, had been decisively and definitively corrected. The immediate aftermath of my impromptu address at the Ainsworth Family Foundation Charity Gala was, to put it mildly, chaotic. Eleanor, her face a mask of stunned disbelief and dawning public humiliation, looked as though she might actually faint. Arthur Sr., for once in his life, seemed utterly speechless, his jaw agape, his usually ruddy complexion a ghastly shade of pale. Caroline, after a moment of frozen horror, erupted, not in words, but in a strangled, incoherent sound of pure, unadulterated fury before her husband, a man whose primary social skills seemed to be damage control, hastily steered her from the ballroom. A departure marked by a flurry of angry, sibilant whispers and the distinct, if distant, sound of a slamming door. The assembled guests, the cream of the city's social and financial elite, were a study in fascinated, barely suppressed agitation. Whispers rippled through the room like wildfire. Eyes darted from the podium to the retreating figures of Caroline and her hapless spouse, then back to Eleanor and Arthur, who now looked less like the benevolent monarchs of a philanthropic empire and more like the stunned survivors of a very public, very messy coup d'etat. Alastair Finch, ever the consummate professional, rose from our table and quietly approached the podium. He picked up the copy of Richard's while I had left there, his expression one of calm, unassailable authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the rising murmur of speculation, "it appears there has been a regrettable misunderstanding regarding the late Mr. Richard Ainsworth's testamentary intentions. Mr. David Miller, as Mr. Ainsworth's surviving spouse and legally appointed executor, has simply sought to clarify the matter in accordance with Mr. Ainsworth's clearly documented and legally binding wishes. All relevant documentation is, of course, a matter of public record and available for scrutiny through the appropriate legal channels. Now, if you'll excuse us, I believe Mr. Miller and I have some rather pressing archival matters to attend to." His use of the word archival, a subtle nod to my profession and the meticulous, evidence-based nature of our position, was a masterstroke of understated legal sarcasm. With a polite nod to the bewildered remaining occupants of the dais, Alastair escorted me from the ballroom, leaving behind a scene of social carnage and rapidly imploding reputations. We didn't speak until we were safely ensconced in the quiet anonymity of Alastair's waiting limousine. Then he turned to me, a rare, almost boyish grin spreading across his usually stoic features. "Well, David," he said, his eyes twinkling, "I must say in all my years of litigation, I have rarely witnessed such a comprehensively effective deployment of a well-prepared legal document in a hostile public forum. Your timing was impeccable. Your delivery, if I may say so, quite devastatingly precise. Richard would have been immensely proud, and, I suspect, rather amused." I allowed myself a small, weary smile. "It wasn't about amusement, Alastair," I said. "It was about truth, and about honoring Richard's memory in the way he deserved, free from their reinterpretations." The days and weeks that followed were a flurry of legal activity, though most of it was now on their side, a desperate, flailing attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of their public humiliation and their thwarted financial ambitions. Mr. Weatherby, their outmatched solicitor, made a few more token efforts to contest Richard's will, citing vague claims of last-minute changes and lack of clarity. But Alastair, armed with Richard's meticulously documented medical records, which showed him to be of perfectly sound mind at the time the trust and will were executed, and the unwavering testimony of the independent witnesses to those documents, systematically dismantled each claim. The triumvirate of entitlement, faced with irrefutable legal reality and the prospect of even greater public exposure of their avarice, should they pursue a losing court battle, eventually, reluctantly, capitulated. They signed a formal agreement, acknowledging the validity of Richard's will and the terms of his trust, renouncing any further claims on his estate, and even, in a final, galling concession, agreeing to contribute to Alastair's not inconsiderable legal fees. The map collection, Richard's cherished legacy, was now securely and unequivocally under my stewardship. Ainsworth and Miller Antiquarian Books, our shared business, continued to operate under my sole direction. And the Ainsworth family home, the one they had so confidently assumed would revert to the direct bloodline, remained, as per Richard's wishes and our joint tenancy agreement, mine. Their defeat was total, their ambitions comprehensively thwarted, not by aggression or malice on my part, but by the simple, unyielding power of Richard's foresight and the meticulous application of the law. The social fallout for Eleanor, Arthur, and Caroline was, by all accounts, considerable. The Ainsworth Family Foundation Charity Gala became an infamous local legend, a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties and bridge clubs about the perils of underestimating a quiet, bookish spouse and the unexpected drama that can erupt when hidden truths are brought to light in a room full of crystal chandeliers and influential witnesses. Eleanor's reign as the undisputed queen of the city's philanthropic scene came to an abrupt and rather ignominious end. Arthur Sr. retreated into a grumpy, self-imposed exile in his golf club, his pronouncements on any subject now carrying considerably less weight. And Caroline, I heard through the grapevine, had embarked on a series of increasingly desperate and largely unsuccessful attempts to rebrand herself, her social standing irrevocably damaged by her public display of greed and her subsequent, comprehensive legal defeat. As for me, life settled into a new, quieter, but infinitely more authentic rhythm. I continued to manage Ainsworth and Miller, finding solace and satisfaction in the familiar world of rare books and ancient maps, a world Richard and I had built together, a world that now felt like his most precious and enduring legacy to me. I established a research fellowship in Richard's name at the local university, funding scholarly work in the history of cartography, a fitting tribute to his passion. And I began, slowly, tentatively, to build a new life for myself, a life defined not by the expectations or judgments of others, but by my own quiet interests, my own values, my own hard-won peace. The tenuous connection the Ainsworths had so contemptuously dismissed had proven to be a bond of unbreakable strength, forged in love, fortified by law, and ultimately triumphant in its quiet, unwavering assertion of truth. Richard, I knew, would have approved, and in that knowledge, I found a measure of solace and a quiet, enduring satisfaction. The historical record at last was accurate, complete, and unequivocally justly mine. The years following the rather spectacular denouement at the Ainsworth Family Foundation Charity Gala brought a profound, if not entirely unexpected, recalibration to the lives of all involved. For me, it was a period of quiet consolidation and a renewed sense of purpose. Ainsworth and Miller Antiquarian Books, now solely under my stewardship, flourished. Freed from the subtle but persistent pressure to conform to the Ainsworths' more conventional notions of success, I was able to guide the business in directions that truly reflected Richard's and my shared passions. Specializing in particularly rare cartographic works, early scientific treatises, and forgotten historical manuscripts. We became known internationally for our expertise, our integrity, and the exceptional quality of our acquisitions. The Richard Ainsworth Research Fellowship in Cartography at the university also became a significant success, attracting bright young scholars from around the world, their research adding new layers of understanding to the maps Richard had so loved. It was a living legacy, a dynamic tribute to his intellectual curiosity and his generous spirit. My personal life, too, found a new, more peaceful equilibrium. The grand Victorian townhouse, once a battleground of unspoken resentments and familial expectations, now felt truly like my own, a sanctuary filled with books, maps, and the quiet hum of my own thoughts. Mrs. Gable, our steadfast housekeeper, continued to manage the household with her usual quiet efficiency, her loyalty an unspoken but deeply appreciated constant in a world that had often felt anything but. I reconnected with old friends, pursued hobbies I'd long neglected, long-distance cycling, learning to play the cello, badly, but with enthusiasm, and found a quiet joy in the simple rhythms of a life lived authentically on my own terms. The Ainsworth Triumvirate, as Alastair Finch still privately, and rather gleefully referred to them, faded into a kind of self-imposed social obscurity. Eleanor, stripped of her philanthropic crown and the automatic deference her social standing had once commanded, reportedly became a rather reclusive figure, her days filled with tending her roses and lamenting, to anyone who would still listen, the unfortunate misunderstandings that had led to her family's altered circumstances. Arthur Sr. spent most of his time at his golf club, his pronouncements on the declining standards of modern society now largely confined to the equally dyspeptic ears of his fellow retirees. Caroline, after a series of ill-fated attempts to launch herself as a luxury lifestyle consultant, a venture that foundered spectacularly due to a conspicuous lack of both luxury and clients, eventually retreated into a bitter, resentful anonymity, her dreams of effortless affluence replaced by the harsh realities of a significantly downsized existence. They never attempted to contact me directly again after the settlement. The legal and social defeat had been too complete, too public. Our connection, tenuous as it had always been from their perspective, was now well and truly severed, a clean, surgical excision performed by the sharp, unyielding scalpel of Richard's meticulously crafted will and Alastair Finch's legal acumen. Occasionally, I would hear snippets of news about them through Penelope Davies, the young archivist who had so bravely guarded Richard's cataloging notes. Penelope had become a good friend, a kindred spirit who shared my passion for history and my appreciation for Richard's intellectual legacy. She had eventually, with the support of the Ainsworth Fellowship, completed her doctorate and was now a respected curator at a major national library. She would sometimes encounter Caroline at obscure auction previews, still, it seemed, trying to dabble in the world of antiques, though now as a rather desperate bottom feeder rather than a confident connoisseur. "She always looks so diminished, Mr. Miller," Penelope once remarked, her voice tinged with a professional sadness. Like a poorly restored painting, all the original vibrancy lost beneath layers of cheap varnish. It was a fitting, if melancholic, assessment. The true surprise of that long-ago charity gala, the one that continued to resonate through the years, was not the public exposure of their greed, but the quiet, enduring power of Richard's love and foresight. He had known his family, their strengths, their weaknesses, their capacity for both affection and avarice. And he had, with a wisdom that still humbled me, taken steps to protect not just his assets, but also the integrity of his life's work and the well-being of the person he had chosen to share that life with. His will, his trust, these were not just legal documents. They were his final, loving act of stewardship, a testament to a bond that transcended bloodlines, a connection that was anything but tenuous. One crisp autumn afternoon, many years later, I was carefully cataloging a newly acquired 17th-century atlas, its hand-colored maps a breathtaking panorama of a world then still largely unknown. Alastair Finch, now retired but still a regular visitor to my shop, was sitting in Richard's old leather armchair, a glass of sherry in his hand. "You know, David," he said, his eyes twinkling, "I often think back to that Ainsworth gala. The sheer, unadulterated shock on Eleanor's face when you read from Richard's will. It was a moment of pure, unalloyed, legal poetry." I smiled, the memory no longer holding any sting, only a faint, ironic amusement. It was certainly a definitive clarification of the historical record, Alastair. Indeed, he chuckled, and a rather expensive lesson for them in the importance of due diligence and perhaps basic human decency. He paused, then added, his voice softening, "Richard would be very proud of you, David, of what you've done with the business, with his legacy. You've honored him in the best possible way, by living a life of integrity, passion, and quiet, unshakable strength." His words were a balm, a quiet affirmation of a journey that had been both arduous and, ultimately, deeply rewarding. The Ainsworths had tried to define me by my connection to them, to diminish me, to dispossess me. But in the end, it was Richard's love, his trust, his meticulously planned legacy that had defined my future, empowering me to build a life of my own, a a life of purpose, a life filled with the quiet, enduring beauty of things well-made, well-loved, and well-preserved. The DNA test they had implicitly demanded, the test of true familial connection, had been administered not in a lab, but in a lawyer's office, in a public ballroom, and in the quiet unfolding of the years that followed. And the results, I knew with a certainty that needed no scientific validation, were irrefutable. Love, loyalty, and a shared passion for the enduring truths found in old books and ancient maps. These were the true, unshakable bloodlines. And by that measure, my connection to Richard and to his true legacy was not just binding, it was eternal. The passage of time continued its gentle, inexorable work, smoothing the sharp edges of old grievances, transforming once raw wounds into faded scars, each with its own story, its own lesson. Ainsworth and Miller Antiquarian Books became a venerable institution in its own right, a beacon for collectors and scholars, its reputation for integrity and exceptional provenance a direct reflection of Richard's and my founding principles. The Richard Ainsworth Research Fellowship had, by then, supported a generation of young cartographic historians, their published works a testament to the enduring power of his intellectual curiosity. I, too, found a new rhythm in my later years. While still actively involved in the business, I dedicated more time to my own scholarly pursuits, contributing articles to academic journals, occasionally lecturing at universities, and finding immense satisfaction in mentoring aspiring bibliophiles and researchers. The quiet world of dusty archives and forgotten manuscripts remained my sanctuary, a place of endless discovery and intellectual challenge. One afternoon, while sifting through a box of uncatalogued ephemera acquired from a minor stately home auction, I came across a small, unassuming, leather-bound diary. Its pages, filled with a delicate, spidery script, detailed the daily life of a young woman in the late 18th century. Her hopes, her fears, her observations on the social and political upheavals of her time. It was a small, intensely personal window into a lost world, a forgotten voice suddenly, unexpectedly brought back to life. As I carefully transcribed her words, I was struck by a particular passage. It is a curious thing, this notion of inheritance. Some believe it to be merely a matter of blood and property, of names and titles passed down through generations. But I have come to believe that the truest inheritance lies not in what is tangible, but in what is remembered, in the values instilled, the passions shared, the quiet acts of love and foresight that shape a life and echo long after we are gone. Her words resonated with a profound, almost startling clarity. This unknown young woman, writing over 2 centuries ago, had articulated the very essence of what Richard's legacy, and indeed my own life's work, had come to represent. It wasn't about the Ainsworth ancestral lands, or the family silver, or the carefully cultivated social standing Eleanor and Caroline had so desperately clung to. It was about the enduring power of shared passions, of intellectual curiosity, of integrity, of love that transcends the merely biological.